To my melanated family and spiritually conscious brothers and sisters around the world. I am Brother Tommy. And it is time to get it in. One Love Family. This video discusses the origin of policing in America. And proves that the policing of blacks have not changed since slavery times. Shackled and Surveilled, Law and Order During Slavery. The history of law enforcement in the United States is inextricably linked to the history of slavery and settler colonialism in early America. Since the origins of modern American policing and imprisonment, black people, free, enslaved, and self-emancipated, have consistently been the targets of unique forms of policing and confinement. Marked by the circumstances of their birth and skin color, Africans who were forced to migrate to the New World toiled in bondage and survived 10 generations of slaveholding oppression before 1865. With the notable exception of Sally Hadden's 2003 slave patrols, few historians have focused on the intricacies of law enforcement systems in colonial and antebellum America and offered detailed insight into the way black people confronted various forms of surveillance under the authority of emerging state and local prison and policing institutions. Nonetheless, historians of regionally distinctive policing practices that developed within and outside of newly established U.S. court systems maintain that punitive responses to slavery, emancipation, and urbanization should be seen as foundational antecedents for the transformations in policing and punishment that took hold across America after the Civil War. Bound to the plantation by what Walter Johnson has labeled the carceral landscape established by both planters and state authorities, few enslaved women and men interacted with the formal justice system. Still, jails and prisons in the southern United States emerged as critical mechanisms to reinforce the institution of slavery. Traders housed slaves in jails and prisons, usually attached to workhouses, before leasing them out or selling them at auction. Planters had the option of delivering slaves to jailers, who would inflict whippings, brandings, and other forms of torture if owners wished not to perform such punishments themselves. Finally, railroad companies, state authorities, and slaveholders also subjected suspected fugitives to hard labor, with the proceeds returning to the jail or prison itself. However, information recorded in state vouchers that slaveholders received after courts not of record convicted one or more of their slaves on capital offenses reveals that enslaved people were indicted for a variety of crimes, ranging from murder of a master or overseer to rape of a white person or slave child. Despite a few documented cases, the vast majority of enslaved Africans were not formally incarcerated for criminal charges. Rather, local legal mechanisms and extralegal customs for controlling enslaved persons and unwanted populations prevailed. The abolition of slavery in northern states during the first half of the 19th century coincided with the birth of the modern penitentiary. At Newgate, the first state prison in New York, for example, 25% of those confined between 1797 and 1828 were of African descent, even though free black people only accounted for roughly 12% of the population in the state. And in Philadelphia, home to the largest community of free black people in the nation at about 15% of the city's total population, 43% of the men and women incarcerated in the city's penitentiary in 1816 were identified as Negro or mulatto. These figures underscore the extent to which black Americans have suffered disparate rates of confinement from the very beginnings of imprisonment in America. Although slave states in the southern and western U.S. territories maintained few penitentiaries during this period, these regions gave rise to America's first system of organized, civilian-based law enforcement. In colonial New England, settlers organized early law enforcement bodies known as Indian constables, and in the early 19th century police forces emerged in St. Louis and other frontier cities to monitor American Indians and protect white residents from their possible retaliation. In the antebellum South, all-white citizen patrols possessed legal authority over black people. Poor and wealthy white men armed with whips and guns policed the areas surrounding plantations and supplemented the general surveillance sustained by overseers, slaveholding families, and local officials. Charged with the responsibilities of slave management, insurrection suppression, and the maintenance of white racial and social order, slave patrollers served as the pre-modern predecessors for law enforcement practices that have shaped American history. Any person of African descent in the slave states who appeared to be outside of the control of a white master and failed to otherwise prove their free status could be seized and imprisoned by nearly any capable white civilian. These elaborate patrol networks established formidable law enforcement groups that were subjected to the authority of slave-holding elites. From the early Republic to the Civil War, slave patrols enforced planters' control over the person and labor of their slaves by maintaining three primary duties: raiding slave dwellings looking for weapons and educational contraband, dispersing slave gatherings, and patrolling the areas around plantations and towns to apprehend suspects for cruel and corporal punishment. Patrollers tended to concentrate these tasks at the largest plantations, where it was easier to monitor slaves and where slaveholders' power was concentrated at the county level. As a result, the wealthiest slaveholders single-handedly molded the legal and penal system of the slave South by giving civilian patrollers enforcement authority. Unfortunately, because of the sparse records retained by slave patrols and their commanders, early accounts of crime in 18th-century America hardly provide a detailed picture of slave patrol operations or the way slaves interacted with these civilian bodies. To be sure, slave patrols profoundly shaped the way free and unfree black people navigated their status. Enslaved men and women perceived slave patrollers as an integral component of the larger structure of racial domination that shaped their daily lives and sought to control their every move to prevent large-scale revolt. Yet despite even the best attempts on the part of slaveholders to prevent insurrection with the use of counter-insurgent patrols, slaves routinely instrumentalized tools of defiance and insubordination to undermine white supremacist legal authority. We have a sense of the way slaves used court systems to stake claims to citizenship and property, but additional social historical research is required to reconstruct the local histories of slave patrollers and the targets they pursued. Although most law enforcement and criminal justice institutions were idiosyncratic and decentralized during the antebellum period, law and order systems in the southern, western, and northern free state regions of the United States were all tightly bound to the enforcement of slavery, especially after the passage of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. From Charleston to Detroit, community leaders organized forces to combat criminal threats and maintain order in America's most turbulent cities and towns. County sheriffs and town constables in the North operated similarly to slave patrols and militiamen in the South to quell mob uprisings and enforce a rigid community ethos of law and order based on strict moral guidelines that largely embodied the religious views and social expectations of the ruling majority. This Protestant elite moral order targeted disorderly immigrants in northern cities, as well as free and enslaved persons of color, while Southern slave societies enforced a rigid racial order that subjugated unruly slaves and defined social relations for propertyless white people. Slavery ensured that black people were the object of surveillance and social control throughout the country. Southern and western cities did not exclusively rely on municipal policing models and urban law enforcement reforms based in London, Boston, New York, and elsewhere in the mid to late 19th century. Industrial elites and local businessmen effectively buttressed the development of modern, professionalized urban police departments in order to protect their property interests and squash labor struggles from a growing class of mobile wage earners, composed mostly of working-class immigrants. Regardless of region, however, the defining characteristics of the criminal fundamentally influence the purpose and practice of police power, namely protecting white property and maintaining the social order by controlling the urban poor, enslaved blacks, and other marginalized groups. Thus, we must understand the history of incarceration, state militias, civilian police forces, and slave patrols in the antebellum period as phenomena embedded within a larger and longer history of racism, violence, and law enforcement in America. Thanks for listening, family, and for supporting the Melanated Roots channel. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Until the next video. Peace.